Thank you for staying with us. It's time for a big interview on The Big Question. Justice Lee Mudoge is a judge of the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals, the successor of the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And he knows what it means for a country to fall apart and the very long path that it takes to get some of these countries back on track. He's joining me this evening to talk more about the state in which we find ourselves. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Let's start with the latest in terms of the political situation. So NASA has said that it is temporarily stopping its protests in honor of those who were its supporters and have passed on. Do you think that will serve to calm tensions, de-escalate tensions in the country?
I don't expect they will. What they will give is a pause, because of course if they don't go to the streets, then there will be nothing to be reported in the evening on anybody who got shot or whatever it is. But I don't think of itself it will help in de-escalating, because it's an emphasis. It's emphasizing the brutality with which the demonstrations have been taken. And while it's a good thing for them to take time to think about those who have fallen in the struggle, and that might maybe help them to change the direction of the struggle. I don't see myself that it's a de-escalation measure.
All right. The International Criminal Court now says that it will respond in writing as to whether it will be probing the NASA leaders Raila Odinga and Kalonzo Musyoka over alleged ethnic incitement. What do you think of the fact that, though not properly before the ICC, the situation in Kenya is now in one way or another before this court again?
I personally don't see a situation which would create interest in ICC as we sit at the present moment. Of course, as you know, we are still members of the ICC, and so if a situation was to generate so as to become a situation that is of concern, and if the government of Kenya is unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute offenders, then it can invoke the jurisdiction of the ICC. But I don't see that anywhere near. It's premature. Pretty far away.
All right. Okay, as things stand, do you believe that IBC can carry out a presidential election in conformity with the Constitution?
IBC, the Commission? Yes, of course not. Of course, why not?
Well, some argue that there hasn't been sufficient negotiation in terms of the electoral process. NASA in particular saying that this whole process is illegal. And adding to that is the political environment, which brings into question the free and fair components. You're reaching for your constitution.
This whole process is governed by this document.
Right.
And the court ordered, directed that a fresh election be held with strict compliance with the provisions of the Constitution. I see nothing that would stop the IBC from strictly holding an election in strict compliance of the Constitution. If they do not do so, it is not because they cannot do so. It's because they deliberately don't want to do so.
And so when NASA says that they have irreducible minimums, which are in conformity or in the spirit of the Constitution, and because those irreducible minimums have not been met, therefore this cannot be a presidential election, but as they say, quote, a jubilee selection. What do you think of that?
You see, again, I go back to my book. What the court ordered was not a jubilee election. What the court ordered was a fresh election, and a fresh election is referred to in our Constitution. And the fact that IEBC was not, nobody in IEBC was declared to have been found to have been committed a criminal, an electoral offense, it means the IEBC remained capable and competent to carry out a fresh election. And there is no reason, I see no reason why they can't do it in accordance with the Constitution.
All right. But illegalities were found to be committed. The fact that the court did not specifically point out who committed those illegalities does not mean that something criminal did not happen.
Well, I have had the opportunity to read the judgment of the court. It didn't spell out to me the specific illegalities which I would regard as now not capable of being rectified by the IEBC. I saw nothing that the court said which the IEBC can't do properly according to the Constitution.
All right. Earlier I asked you about whether that presidential election can take place in full conformity to the law, not just on the legal side, but also the political situation in the country. And as we saw earlier in this broadcast, IEBC is having challenges in its preparedness for the election in certain areas in Kisumu, Migori, Vihiga, Siaya, largely, of course, NASA strongholds, where either some of the officials are afraid to show up for training. We've seen training sessions disrupted. What can the commission do to safeguard the election within the law?
You see, that's a law and order matter. In fact, it is not. It's not for the commission. The commission is not the keeper of law and order. The keeper of order is the Department of Internal Security. And it is for them to ensure that the IEBC can carry out its work in those periods. And I really don't see that it is impossible to do that.
And the reason I ask this is because when you hear the legal debate surrounding whether there will in fact be an election on October 26th, a presidential election on October 26th, it surrounds the reading of the law where this election must take place in all 290 constituencies. And then added to that argument is the question as to whether for an election to be held, there must be at least even one vote cast, or must IEBC just put everything in order for voting to take place, regardless of whether people show up or not? So with that in mind, and with these prevailing circumstances, do you see any challenges in terms of meeting that legal threshold?
No. You see, Anne, there are 19
290 constituencies?
No, there are 290 constituencies, but the voters themselves, the people who can vote are 19 million.
Right.
People. There are 19 million people. 8 or 9 or maybe 6 or 7 of those are in what you would call NASA strongholds, right? But there is no, I don't think there's any constituency in which there is not a single one non-NASA person, right? There are eight presidential candidates. I don't think that we are in a position where you can say that there is a constituency where only a NASA candidate can secure a vote. There are many constituencies where only a NASA candidate can win. But securing a vote, I doubt myself that there is such a position. So if the IEBC goes out to carry out, and it must because it was directed by the court to do so, carry out an election, all it needs to be provided is adequate security to do so. And remember, it is a violation of the law to stop any other person from casting their vote. It is illegal. It is something which would take you to prison if you engage in it. Everybody is free to vote or not to vote, but nobody is free to stop the other person from voting.
And yet we've seen statements from political hardliners that warn of some unspecified consequences if people go to vote in their electoral areas where these hardliners govern. And it brings the feeling that there are certain untouchables, as it were. The law is there, but at least from what we can see, is not being seen to be applied.
I do not know of any untouchables. The fearmongers, and fearmongers are there all over the place, will tell you everything that will happen. The world will come to an end if you do this or the other, or say or the other. But come 26, if the IEBC comes out with and raises out its apparatus for election, people will go to vote.
But hardliners do exist, and many of them on both sides of the political divide, of course, are backed by millions of followers.
There are 230,000 police officers available in this country to restrain anyone who wants to break the law.
All right. Some people are saying that it is time to dialogue, that there needs to be talks before we go into these elections, that the political temperatures are quite high. Do you see it that way?
The political temperatures are quite high, I agree. Whether dialogue will remove them, I doubt, and also I doubt what kind of dialogue. You know, and we have given our country to politicians, and I think it is not right that we do so. I think we should keep our country. The politicians have taken it over, and now they almost lead us to think that we live at their will. That what they say, what they decide, what they think, what they do, is what should govern us. We went into a lot of trouble to put up a governing structure in what we now call the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Mm-hmm. We read out how everything is to be governed, how voting is to happen, how what rights everybody has, including the rights to vote, the rights to cast your vote, the right to have it counted, and so on and so forth. Now, having done that, now politicians come around and they want to own us, right? When I say stop, you stop. When I say no voting, there is no voting. When I say you go and vote for so-and-so, you go and vote for those. That is something we must run away from. And I'm absolutely certain myself that Kenyans are now a lot wiser than they used to be in the days of the one single party politics. I think Kenyans now know what their constitution provides, and I know those who want to vote will be wanting to cast their vote, and it is their right to cast their vote, and nobody else should stop them from exercising their right. I
want to go past the 26th, and there are those on either side who will have statements that are frightening, statements like "Kama nimbaya nimbaya." It's a kind of dog whistling that leads one to conclude that they are not afraid, possibly even welcome the possibility of violence post-October 26th to achieve a certain political end. Based on your experience in the international tribunals that you've sat on and seeing how things can go wrong and completely wrong, and then what it takes to bring a country back from that point of mbaya ni mbaya, what would you say to those who seem, unafraid of it?
They are just reckless. They don't know what they are talking about. Anybody who saw what happened in Rwanda in 1994, in those 100 days between April the 14th and July the 15th, would never want that to happen to a country in which he lives. But recklessness is part of what we have in our society, and I think that's why we have a law and order organization mechanism to control the rights of those, and we have a judiciary to deal with them. And my call to the country at the moment is that we must restrain, we mustn't avoid getting everyone accountable. Politician or no politician, everybody must be accountable for what they say and what they do. And those who are shouting in this way and shouting in the other one must be brought to account.
But there's a feeling that, again, returning to my earlier question on the so-called untouchables in our dispensation, that going for such leaders will only precipitate violence from their supporters.
The obedience of the law is an obligation. It is not a choice. People don't obey the law because they like the law. People obey the law because the law requires them to be obeyed. And if you don't obey it, the law also tells you what will happen to you. And that should happen to anybody. No one is above the law.
You've, of course, from your work, seen the experience of Rwanda, which you've quoted, of Yugoslavia, etc. And I don't want to suggest that the Republic is necessarily standing on the edge of that, but this is something that we've seen in our lifetime. In what ways would you say Kenya is heading down the wrong path, and these are the places where we need to think hard and turn back from?
The fact, for instance, that somebody can proudly go and say, we will stop the election from happening, we will forcibly stop the election from happening, and attempt to do so, if he is let to thrive, to let that happen, it means we are disregarding the law. And when we disregard the law, that is a determination that we are going on the wrong side. There is no country can survive a disregard of its own law. So obedience to the law and obedience to this constitution are the primary guarantees for our security.
Do you think the law, the judiciary are being undermined in this process? And I say that knowing that we've seen a record number of cases before the courts throughout this election period.
Well, I say this, and perhaps this is something not everybody will agree with. Mm-hmm. I think there has been a more than usual or active use of the courts, bordering on abuse of the court. People are running to the courts to get orders and directions, and the court has somehow become, I think, generous about it, because anything that happens, there are 5 or 6 people who are running to court to get that or that order and all that. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that it no longer appears to have any consequences to institute proceedings that have no basis in law. In the earlier days, when I used to practice, you didn't do that, because if you went to court, you got and you were not successful, you were made to pay damages and you were made to pay court fees and things like that. We abolished or reduced that in order to enhance access to justice, but it's clearly being abused. That's my view, and it's not a view that I expect everybody to accept, to hold.
All right, fair enough. You have said that it is your view that IEBC can run this election in accordance with the law on 26th. But the question of, the solution to the political situation remains. In your mind, what is the way forward?
We are in what is called, some people are saying we are in a crisis. Others are saying we are not in a crisis. And the truth is between the two. In some aspects, we are in a crisis because we are at a time when the presidency is an incumbency. In other words, there are certain things the presidency can't do, which it needs to do to get the enforcement of the law effective. For instance? For instance, it may want to change certain officers. It can't change because they are protected, or the right to do so has been taken away and things like that. It can't. There are certain directions that it may be able to, it may be able and willing to give, which it can't give because of the incumbency. But that incumbency will end on the 26th or soon thereafter, when the election has been carried out and a president has been elected. And that president who gets elected on the 26th has the huge burden of uniting this country. It will be his responsibility as head of government to do what needs to be done to bring people closer together than they are now.
And where would that president begin?
Where would he begin?
How do you start to do that?
Well, there are various ways. If it was me, but I'm not on the ballot, but supposing I was on the ballot and I became the president that was elected, what would I do? I would probably look at the difficulties that are creating the difference, right? And the difficulties that are creating the difference is a feeling of inequality in the access to national resources.
Right.
I would find a way of getting that addressed. I would probably go into what might be called a national dialogue for kickstarting that. I don't know whether you are old enough to remember when we had
I'm old enough.
the dialogue
right.
of the Nairobi, the Kenya we want.
Of course.
At KIA.
Yes.
I would probably rethink the possibility of having that. And I think
that was spearheaded by the then Prime Minister.
Yes, that's right. And I think we are probably coming closer to a time when we ought to review our constitution and find out what is not working.
What is not working? What has this whole process exposed to you that isn't working in terms of our legal framework and the way in which we get into elections?
You see, we mustn't forget our past. We came from a past in which we were divided. And we were divided from the beginning, from the days of the colonial government, when the divide and rule was the administrative structure for the colonial government. And we grew out of there as tribes, antagonistic to other tribes. And we have never been able to outgrow that. And in fact, no effort has ever been made significantly to bring people, to create a nation. This is a
colonial hangover, is what you're saying?
It began in the colonial days. It's an inheritance. It's a heritage from the colonial administration of divided people, because the colonial administrator wanted to divide the tribes so that he can control them in what was then called the divide and rule. Now, our politics grew on that line, with Kadu and Kanu growing in parallel, but each of them being a conglomerate of tribes. Tribes in Kanu and Kadu, who then grew up into following politicians, so that our politics becomes really a stepping stone for certain political people to greatness. And it is what we are suffering from even as we sit here. It is not that the people in this constituency and the people in that constituency are being administered differently or are receiving national support differently. It is a perception that has been created for the purposes of politicians, because the politicians regard us as their property for electoral use.
And I think that's an important note to pause on. if this is a colonial hangover that we're experiencing, the tribal conflict, the conflicts that we're dealing with, then I think that is one way we can all go to bed tonight and think, are we still in a way under that yoke? Unfortunately, we are absolutely out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Judge, for coming to studio tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for your words. Thank you for your wisdom. And that's all the time we had on The Big Question tonight. I am Anki Guta, sitting in for Hussein Mohammed. You have a good night, a great rest of the week ahead, and I'll see you Thursday on Opinion Court and, of course, Citizen Live at 9. Good night. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. How did you find that?